हाँ
वो जो दवाई हमने दी थी वो,
हाँ
अरे हमारा पेट ठीक
animals
तो हो गया है,
हाँ मामा
हमारे पेट में हल्का सा बड़ों हो रही है।
अरे चलो animals talk to each other, of course, there can be no question about that, but I suppose there are very few people who can understand them.
अब क्या हम लोग तो शुरुआत से पढ़ रहे हो ना,
हाँ मामा
क्या है क्या
मतलब
है?
what stumped the blue jays? I never knew but one man who could. I knew he could what because however because he told me so himself. मतलब जानवर एक दूसरे से बात करते हैं, ठीक है ना, तो मतलब एक आदमी मतलब पर एक आदमी जो है समझ सकता था, जानवर एक दूसरे से बात करते पर इंसान तो समझ नहीं पाते, है ना. He was a middle-aged, simple-heighted miner who had lived in a lonely corner of California, among the woods and mountains, a good many years, and had studied the ways of his only neighbors, the beasts and the birds. And he believed he could accurately translate any remark which they make. This was Jim Baker. According to Jim Baker, some animals have only a limited education and use only very simple words, and scarcely ever a comparison or a flowery figure, whereas certain other animals have large vocabulary, a fine command of language, a fine command of language, and a certain ready and fluent delivery. Consequently, these latter talk a great deal, they like it, they're conscious of their talent, and they enjoy showing off. मतलब कुछ जानवर तो बहुत सीधी सादी भाषा बोलेंगे और कुछ भाषा जो है बहुत कुछ जानवर जो है बहुत कॉम्प्लिकेटेड बोलेंगे, है ना, उनकी वोकेबलरी जो है बहुत एडवांस्ड होगी, फ्लारी होगी. Baker said that after long and careful observation, he had come to the conclusion that the blue jays were the best talkers he had found among birds and beasts. Said he, "There's more to a blue jay than any other creature. He has got more moods and more different kinds of feelings than any other creatures. And mind you, whatever a blue jay feels, he can put you into language. उसको जो भी फील करता है वो लैंग्वेज में वो कर देता है, राइट. And no more commonplace language either, but rattling out and out book talk and bristling with metaphor too, just bristling. And as for the command of language, why you never see a blue jay get stuck for a word. No man ever did. मतलब ब्लू जेज जो था उसके हिसाब से कहने में जो था ना बहुत अच्छी बोलते हैं. अब ब्लू जेज होते कौन है मुझे भी नहीं पता क्या है. They just boil out of him. And another thing, I've noticed a good deal that there is no bird or cow or anything that uses as good a grammar as a blue jay. You may say a cat uses a good grammar. Well, a cat does, but you let a cat get excited once, you let a cat get to pulling fur with another cat on a shared night, and you will grammar that will give you a lockjaw. आप बिल्ली को अगर लड़ा लो तो ऐसी भाषा सुनने की पड़ेगी कि तुम्हारा मुंह एकदम फटाका फटा रह जाएगा. पर ब्लू जेज का जो है ना कैट का भी अच्छा ग्रामर होता है, ठीक है ना. पर ब्लू जेज का सबसे बढ़िया ग्रामर होता है. उसका कहना था पता नहीं क्या पता. नीलकंठ. Ignorant people think it's the noise which the fighting cats make that is so aggravating, but it's so. It's the sickening grammar they use. तो बिल्लियाँ जब लड़ती हैं तो ये नहीं होता कि जो चिल्ला रही हैं वो तो लैंग्वेज यूज़ कर रही हैं वो प्रॉब्लमेटिक होती हैं. Now, I never heard a jay use a bad grammar, but a very seldom, and when they do, they are as ashamed as a human. They shall write down and leave. You may call Jay a bird, so he is in a measure, because he's got feathers on him and don't belong to no church, perhaps. But otherwise, he's just as much as humans as you and me. पर उसका feather वगैरह है पर वो ऐसा human ही होता है. And I'll tell you for why. A jay's gift and instincts and feelings and interests cover the whole ground. A jay hasn't got any more principle than a congressman. मतलब वो unprincipled होती हैं. A jay will lie, a jay will steal, a jay will deceive, a jay will betray, and 4 times out of 5, a jay will go back on its solemnest promise. The sacredness of an obligation is a thing which you can't cram into blue jay's head. ब्लू जे पे के शब्द वर्ड्स पे कोई विश्वास नहीं कर सकता. Now on top of all this is another thing, a jay can outswear any gentleman in the mines. और जो गालियाँ देते हैं ना वो गाली गलौज वाली वो भी जय कर सकती है. You think a cat can swear? Well, a cat can. But you give Blue Jay a subject that calls for his reserve powers, and where is a cat? Don't talk to me, I know too much about this thing. अरे बिल्ली बिल्ली कुछ नहीं कहे हैं ब्लू जे जब गाली गलौज पे उतर आती है ना तो पता भी नहीं लगता एंड देयर इज येट अनदर थिंग in the one little particular of scolding, just good, clean, out and out scolding, a blue jay can lay over anything human or divine. Yes, sir, a jay is everything that a man is. A jay can cry, a jay can laugh, a jay can feel shame, a jay can reason and plan and discuss, a jay likes gossip and scandal. A jay has got sense of humor, jay knows where he's an ass just well as you do. Maybe better, but if jay ain't a human, he better take in his sign, that's all. I'm going to tell you a perfectly true fact about some blue jays. When I first began to understand jay language correctly, there was a little incident happened here. 7 years ago, the last man in his region moved me away. There stands his house, been empty ever since, a log house with a plank roof, just one big room, no more, no ceiling, nothing between the rafters and the floor. Well, one Sunday morning, I was sitting out here in front of my cabin with my cat, taking the sun and looking at the blue hills, and listening to the leaves rustling so lonely in the trees, and thinking of the home away yonder in the States that I hadn't heard from in 13 years. मतलब एक पड़ोसी था उसका घर था मतलब खाली छत थी ना मैं बैठा हुआ था अपने घर के बारे में सोच रहा था अजीत मामा का था अभी बात कर लेंगे listening to the leaves rustling so lonely in the trees and thinking of the home away yonder in the States that I hadn't heard from in 13 years when a blue jay lit on that house with an acorn in his mouth and said, "Hello, I've reckon I've struck out something." तो एक ब्लू जे आई और उसके मुंह में एक एकॉन था बोला मैंने कुछ देखा When he spoke, the acorn dropped out of his mouth and rolled down the roof, of course, but he didn't care. His mind was all on the thing he had struck. ब्लू जे के मुंह से कौन गिरा कौन जो था मुश्किल से आता है तो ब्लू जे का दिमाग जो था ना उसमें चीज़ It was a knot hole in the roof, knot hole in the roof. He cocked his head to one side, shut one eye, and put the other one to the hole. मतलब ऐसे आंखें की दूसरा वन होल पे डाला Like a possum looking down a jug, then he glanced up and his bright eyes gave a wink or two with his wings. ऐसे करके आंखें खोल के अंदर देखा फिर उसने wink or two किया which signifies gratification he understood and said it looks like a hole it's located like a hole blamed if I don't believe it's a hole. Then he cocked his head down and took another look. He glanced up perfectly joyful this time winks his wing and his tail both and says, "Oh no, this ain't no fat thing, I reckon. If I ain't in luck. Why, it's a perfectly elegant hole." उसको पता नहीं एक hole पता लग गया. Perfectly elegant hole. So he flew down, got that acorn, fetched it up and dropped it in, and it was and was just tilting his head back with the heavenly smile on his face. तो उसको शायद hole चाहिए होता है ना तो वो acorn लेके आया और फिर उसने उस पे hole में डाल दिया. When all of a sudden he was paralyzed into a listening attitude, and that smile faded gradually out of his countenance like a breath of a razor, and the queerest look of surprise took its place. Then he says, "Why I didn't hear it fall?" तो जब उसने होल के अंदर डाला और एकॉन को डाला तो उसको उसकी आवाज़ नहीं आई गिरने की उसने कहा मैं तो गिरते हुए नहीं देखा He cocked his eye at the hole again and took a long look and up and shook his head. Stepped onto the other side of the hole and took another look from that side. Shook his head again. He studied a while and then he just went into details, walked round and round the hole, spied it from every point of the compass. मतलब एक होल मिला था उसको तो उसने उसमें से अकाउंट डाला तो जब अकाउंट में से जब नीचे गिरना चाहिए था तो कोई आवाज़ आनी चाहिए थी उसको मिली नहीं तो उसने कहा आवाज़ नहीं आई तो एक तरफ गया फिर दूसरी तरफ से होल को गया फिर तीसरी तरफ से होल को गया फिर चौथी तरफ से होल को गया ठीक है No use. Then he took a thinking attitude in the comb of the roof and scratched the back of his head with his right foot a minute and finally says, "Well, it's too many for me, that's certain. There must be a mighty long hole. However, I can't get no time to fool around here. I got to tend to business. I reckon it's all right. Chance it anyway. So he flew off, fetched another acorn, and dropped it in, and tried to flirt his eye to the hole, quick enough to see what becomes of it, but he was late. He held his eye there as much as a minute, and then he raised up and sighed and says, "Confound it, I don't seem to understand this thing no way. However, I'll tackle her again." He fetched another acorn, done his level best to see what become of it, but he couldn't. अब ब्लू जे ने उस होल को अकाउंट को होल में डाला तो आवाज़ नहीं आई तो परेशान हो गया भाई जा कहाँ रहा है अकाउंट कहाँ जाना है ना. He says, "Well, I never struck no such hole as this before. I'm of the opinion it's a totally new kind of hole." ऐसा तो होल मुझे कभी दिखा नहीं कि भाई जिसमें कि अगर मैं अकाउंट डालूँ आवाज़ ना आए. ठीक है ना, आवाज़ ना आए. Then he began to get mad. He held it for a spell, walking up and down the comb of the roof and shaking his head and muttering to himself, but his feelings got the upper hand of him. Presently, and he broke loose and cussed himself back in the face. I never see a bird take on no take on. So about a little thing. When he got through, he walks to the hole and looks at it again for half a minute. Then he says, "Well, you're a long hole, a deep hole, and a mighty singular hole altogether. But I've started to fill into you, and I don't fill you if it takes 100 years. मैं 100 साल तक करता रहूँगा जब तक कि मैं तुम्हें fill ना कर दूँ ये अकाउंट के साथ." And with that away he went. You never see a bird work, so since you were born. He laid into his work like a nigger, and the way he hove acorns into that hole for about 2 hours and a half was one of the most exciting and astonishing spectacles I've ever saw. तो वो 2.5 घंटे तक वो अकाउंट्स उस होल में डालता रहा. उसको लगा भाई अब जा कहाँ रहे हैं होल, तो मुझे भी पता नहीं कहाँ पे जा रहे हैं. He never stopped to take a look anymore. He just hove them in and went for more. Well, at last he could hardly flop his wings. He was so tuckered out. He comes drooping down once more, sweating it like an ice pitcher, drops an acorn and says, "Now I guess I've got the bulge on you by this time." So he bent down for a look, and if you'll believe me, when his head came up, he was just as pale with rage. He says, "I've showered acorns enough there to keep in the family of 30 years, and if I can see a sign of one of them, I wish I may land in a museum with a belly full of sawdust in 2 minutes." मतलब इतना ज़्यादा अकाउंट्स मैंने डाले हैं, आराम से मैं रह सकता हूँ. एक भी दिख जाए तो मैं मान जाऊँ क्या बात है. Just had enough strength to crawl up onto the comb and lean his back against the chimney, and then he collected his impressions and began to free his mind. I see in a second that what I had mistook for profanity in the mines was only just the rudiments, as you may say. Another jay was going by and heard him doing his devotions and stopped to going on what it was. The sufferer told him the whole circumstance and says, "Now yonder's the hole. If you don't believe me, go and look for yourself." So this fellow went and looked and comes back and says, "How many did you say did you put in there?" "Not less than any 2 tons." हो सकता है 2 टन के बराबर, 200 के नीचे तक कौन डाले होंगे, says the sufferer. The other jay went and looked again. He could seem to make it out, so he raised a yell, and 3 more jays came. They all examined the hole. They all made the sufferer tell it over again, and then they all discussed it and got off as many leather-headed opinions about it as an average crowd of humans could have done. They called in more jays and then more till pretty soon this whole region appeared to have blue flush about it. बुलाते गए लोगों को भाई कहाँ गए कहाँ गए कहाँ गए. There must have been 5,000 of them then, and such another jawing and disputing and ripping and cussing you never heard. गाली गलोच वगैरह जो है कि भैया वो गया कहाँ ये पता नहीं लग रहा है. Every jay in the whole lot put his eye into the hole and delivered a more chuckle-headed opinion about the mystery than the jay that had just went before him. They examined the house all over too. The door was standing half open, and at last one old jay happened to go and light on it and look in. Of course, that knocked the mystery galley west in a second. There lay the acorns scattered all over the floor. सारे acorns जो थे फ्लोर पे लगे हुए थे. He flopped his wings and raised a whoop. "Come here," he says. "Come here, everybody. And if this fool hadn't been trying to fill up a house with acorns, they all came sweeping down like a blue cloud, and as each fellow lit on the door and took a glass, the whole absurdity of the contract that the first Jay had tackled hit him home, and he fell over backward, suffocating with laughter. And the next Jay took his place and done the same. Well, they saw they roosted around here and the house step and the trees for an hour and guffawed over that thing like human beings. It ain't any use to tell me a blue hasn't got a sense of humor, because I know better and memory too. They brought jays here from all over the United States to look down at that hole every summer for 3 years. वो अकाउंट्स जो थे फ्लोर पे जा रहे थे. अब ये कह रहा था भैया कहाँ पे है, तो एक पुराना बुढ़ा सा वो आया. उसने कहा देखे देखे देखा रहे सब फ्लोर पे नीचे डाले हुए हैं, मतलब एक होल था. तो घर के उसमें जो था ना होल था, घर था खाली था, और घर के मतलब वो थी, तो उसमें एक होल था. तो उसने अकाउंट डाला, उसने सोचा कि भैया ये घर है तो यहाँ पे, पर वो तो छत से नीचे फ्लोर पे जाके गिरा ना. तो वो कह रहा था भैया गया कहाँ, ये मैं इतनी देर से मैं डालता जा रहा हूँ, भरते जा रहा भरता जा रहा है ना. तो उसने दूसरों को बुलाया, किसी को पता नहीं लगा. फिर एक बुढ़े ने देखा साइड से, बोला अरे ये तो फ्लोर पे गिर रहे हैं, तो घर है जिसमें तुम डाल रहे हो. और वो सब आ करके हंसने लगे. They brought jays here from all over the United States to look down that hole every summer for 3 years. Other birds too, and they could all see the point, except and all that came from Nova Scotia to visit the Yosemite, and he took this thing on his way back. He said he couldn't see anything funny in it, but then he was a good deal disappointed about Yosemite. True. From a tramp abroad, 1880. और ये कहानी खत्म हो गई. हाँ हाँ बोलो.